Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to say from the outset that I'll be splitting my time with the member for Salaberry-Sorwa. I'm very pleased today to rise to debate a motion calling for a climate emergency declaration by Canada. It's very important to declare a climate emergency because that's a call for all of us to work together with urgency to meet the biggest challenge this country has faced since World War II and perhaps the biggest challenge in human history. So I will be supporting the government motion, and I'll try not to engage in a polemic about who was first. We had an NDP motion followed quickly by the government motion. I think that's a good idea. Unfortunately, the new Green member has chosen to engage in that polemic before he's even gotten to the House, saying that he somehow takes credit for what's going on here. I welcome him to join us, and I welcome a similar motion from the Green Party, because we do have to work together in this country to meet the challenges of climate change. Now, since the Conservatives have just moved an amendment, I want to address that amendment very quickly at the beginning here. And when the member for Abbotsford says, wait for their plan, I'm a little bit worried about their plan given their amendment today. Let's just point out some things that, three things that their amendment does. First of all, it eliminates climate emergency from the motion. So it takes away what I think is the most important thing about the debate going on in this House now, is that there is that recognition that we have very few years left to act before climate change becomes irreversible and before its impacts make this planet uninhabitable. Second thing it does, it says that human action has an impact on climate change. So here we are back to the Conservatives denying the source of climate change. We know that it's human activity. We know that we are causing the rise in temperatures and the great variations in our climate, and therefore, because we are causing it, we can do something about it. And the third thing that their amendment does is blame everybody else. And so its emphasis is on global action. Yes, of course, global action is required. Action by all of us is required to meet those challenges. But the Conservative amendment places all the emphasis on other people and what other people are doing. Certainly, I hope the whole world will react as one in the attack on climate change. That doesn't excuse us from making sure that we meet our responsibilities in this House and through our government. Now, there have been lots of things thrown about who was first and who has the longest record and who has the strongest record. And I just want to put on the record that I know that there are members in at least two of the parties here, three if we count unofficial parties, who have long and strong records on the environment. And there have been some false things said lately in my writing about my environment record. And so I want to talk just for a minute about this. As a student on the first Earth Day in 1970, I joined with my fellow students. We blocked traffic during rush hour. And I learned a very powerful lesson that day. We made a lot of people angry, and we made no change. And so what I learned at that time is that it's much better to build the coalitions that we need to bring about the changes that are required. Second thing, second time I got involved in climate change, I got a job working for an organization called Pacific Peoples Partnership. It's an Indigenous-led organization which builds links between Indigenous people in Canada and the Pacific Islands. So I became the executive director in 1989. And two issues that Pacific Islanders brought to our attention in 1989, 30 years ago. One was the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the plastic patch in the Pacific Ocean. At that time, it was horrifyingly as big as Vancouver Island. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second issue they wanted us to raise here in Canada was global warming, as it was called then, as a threat to the habitability of the Pacific Islands. Not requiring them to get swimming lessons, as it's often trivialized, but threats to the coral reefs, which protect the ecosystems of those islands. And we're now seeing a huge die-off of coral reefs around the world, and the increased storm surges. And all the Pacific Islands depend on a lens of fresh water that sits underneath the islands. And with the storm surges, they were fearing increasing invasion of those lenses by salt water, which would make the islands uninhabitable. So that was, as I said, 30 years ago when I started working on the issue of climate change. We organized a tour of high schools, and I published a series of articles warning about the impacts of what we were calling then global warming. I was elected to Esquimalt Council in 2010, and when we had our first emergency measures meeting, I asked what we had for oil spills, because we have a long and beautiful coast in Esquimalt, and the answer was nothing. And so I was the first elected official in the country to move a motion against what was then the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Second thing I was able to do on council was to get Esquimalt to become one of the first municipalities in the entire country to adopt science-based greenhouse gas reduction targets. And when people said at the time, what does that mean? It meant to me, and it still means in Esquimalt's policy, that you have to adjust those targets to what is necessary to keep the warming to 1.5 degrees or below. So it wasn't simply, this is what we have to do. We have to do this much and keep our eye on the ball here and maybe do more as time goes on. So when I was doing a tour of high schools 30 years ago, I didn't really imagine that, first of all, that I would ever become an MP, I have to say that, but more importantly, that I'd be standing here in this chamber when the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is now bigger than BC and Alberta combined. Not bigger than Vancouver Island, BC and Alberta combined. And I didn't imagine I'd be standing here when climate change is now clearly a threat to our very survival, and that we would still be so far from any effective action to meet these challenges. So that's where I'm disappointed with the government motion. As I said, I'm happy to support it because anything that brings us together to fight climate change is a good idea. But when reports show that we'll soon have more plastic in the oceans than fish, and when reports show that Canada won't meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets that were set in Paris, a reduction of 25% below 2005 levels by 2030, we won't meet those targets for 200 years with the current policies that are in place. I just couldn't have imagined that this is what I'd be standing here talking about. So I am going to be supporting the government motion despite what I would call omissions. One of the first of those to me is that there's no mention of reconciliation. And a side note, I want to say I've heard Liberals talking about our motion and saying that eliminating fossil fuel subsidies for the NDP means cutting off power in remote Indigenous communities. Nothing could be further from the truth. We've said that a climate change plan has to prioritize reconciliation. And that means dealing with those communities, First Nations communities, who are the most affected by climate change in the attack on traditional activities, in the flooding that we've seen taking place, and in their dependence on diesel fuel, which makes life very, very unaffordable. We have the example in my own riding of the Sooke Nation, who have become energy self-sufficient using solar power, and they now sell power back to the grid. That's what it means to prioritize reconciliation in a climate change plan, to help First Nations become self-sufficient on renewable energy basis that will create good jobs in their communities. There's no mention of workers or jobs in the government's motion. And I firmly believe that we can't get the collective action we need on climate change if we have policies that leave certain parts of Canada behind, certain communities behind, and certain kinds of workers. We know that the technology now exists for a transition to a net carbon zero energy economy very quickly. And that will create good family supporting jobs in every community in this country. We on the NDP have put forward some of our planks. One of those is an energy retrofit to retrofit the entire building and housing stock in this country. That would create good jobs in every community and jobs that will use some of those same skills that people who work in the energy, oil-based energy industry already have. A really good example is geothermal. Geothermal energy uses almost the same skills in terms of engineering and in terms of welding and all those other kinds of things that are already used in the oil patch. So I see that my time is quickly expiring, and so I just want to conclude here by saying once again, I do believe it's important to declare a climate emergency because we are simply running out of time to change. It's no longer a question of the distant future. We've seen the massive forest fires around the country. We've seen the massive flooding. We're already in the midst of what is called the second great extinction. We're about to lose 1 million species of plants and animals. That will destroy the web of life that our very existence depends upon. So many Canadians have already taken individual actions to reduce their carbon footprints, but personal actions alone will not meet these challenges. We must come together in urgent and major collective action to address the threat of climate change. We need a declaration of a climate emergency and plans to attack that emergency very, very quickly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.